The best pass rush duo in the Pac-12 resides in Salt Lake City. But if Utah wants to make the college football playoff, they're going to have to be one of the best pass rush duos in the nation.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We do appreciate it, and we are available on all platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So we're going to talk about why Utah is the best pass rush duo in the Pac-12 today, as well as preview the rest of the defensive line depth in the defensive ends and defensive tackles. And in order to do that, I want to bring on our resident trench expert and former host of this Locked On Utes podcast, as well as a contributor for UteZone, Bryan Brown. Appreciate you coming on today, and I love it when things work out. Bryan, we officially crossed 300 subscribers on the channel today. That started with you a while back, so now appreciate that we've been able to reach this milestone. So thank you to all the fans who have tuned in when this thing first started to Bryan to when I got it going now, and we're really excited for what is to come next.
Yeah, I was there for like subscribers 1 through 10. I think you've done the bulk of the heavy lifting here, so congratulations on passing that mark. It's, you know, as I've talked to people, everybody's been really excited to have you being the captain now and running the ship here with Locked On Utes, especially as I've started to open up some new projects. And, you know, I'm more than anything, I'm just excited for you, man. This has been a great gift for all Utah fans to have Locked On Utes back and rolling daily the way it should be.
Well, I greatly appreciate that, and I'm excited to see some of those other projects as well. Also, shout out to Austin Facer, who held it down in between me and Bryan, helping out as well. We greatly appreciate it. And one thing Ute fans are greatly going to appreciate this season is the pass rush tandem of Junior Tafuna and Van Fillinger. Yes, Utah fans, you know their names, and you heard about them last year, of course, but they still weren't the best two pass rushers on this team overall. When it came down to it, that was still Mika Tafua and Devin Lloyd. But this year, it's going to be Van, it's going to be Junior, and I think they are going to have monster years. And Junior especially, I mean, when you can create that interior pressure, that just ruins everything. We hear so much about when the pocket collapses, quarterbacks stepping up in the pocket. But when you can break the pocket and then force guys to the outside into those oncoming defensive ends, that's such a huge thing. Both Van and Junior do a phenomenal job setting the run. Van has the bend and the athleticism. Van is the perfect body for a defensive end as well. I mean, the length, he really is the total package at that spot. And it just sounds like he's gotten even better in the offseason. So I think he's going to explode he had 5.5 sacks last year. I think he very well could be a double-digit sack guy this year. And I think Junior's going to have another strong year as well. Easier to double, and he's going to see a lot of double teams on the interior. But he's a guy I think could get up to that 6 to 8 sack range as well, just because of what a force he's going to be in the interior this year. But I really think this Utah team has the best pass rush duo in the Pac-12. And I think that if these guys hit on their full potential and are one of the best pass rush duos across the country, I think the Utes are going to find themselves in the college football playoff.
It is very – so I did a little bit of research previously about how important it is to really get sacks and pressure. And as you look back in time, it is really critical, actually. You know, the teams that you think of in terms of college football playoff stalwarts like Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, et cetera, they've all spent time in the top 5 to the top 10 of the country in the years that they made the playoffs. In sacks. And now sacks is a very basic metric that we use to measure pressure. And you know, sacks do matter, but pressure matters more than anything, because pressure creates turnovers, pressure creates chaos, and really defensively what you want is you want to get an offense off schedule and get them outside of their comfort zone. So that, to me, you know, I think if this Utah defense comes through the way that we think it should, and look, it's a lot of talent, there are a lot of young players. You know, Steve Bartle and I have talked about the difference between this being a more opportunistic defense than in 2019, where they were just going to suffocate you. You know, I think if all that comes to fruition, then it could lead to a college football playoff berth. You know, there are other things that I personally, I think the bigger factor for this team is Cam Rising. You know, as long as he can stay healthy throughout the course of the year, I think that's really what's going to push them in or out of the playoff. But it's interesting you talk about that dynamic of having a pass rush duo, because I think traditionally we think in terms of having ends on either side, and really what it is it's these two guys coming from this angle, or one guy from the middle and one guy from the outside, and then whatever else you fill in around kind of fill in the gaps with. And that's kind of a unique situation, because in the past we've seen a lot of defensive ends be the stalwarts for Utah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's going to be fun to see these guys step into that role this season. And I love that you highlighted pressures as well. I think that's such a big thing where Coach Scally talked about, he thought Van was playing his best football towards the end of the season. Well, he had 3.5 sacks versus Washington State, but that just goes to show you those pressures making that impact matters so much more. And I think let's start with Junior, because Junior's a guy, Pac-12 defensive freshman of the year. He's a guy who didn't even start the first game of the season, but then from there really exploded and took off, had arguably his best game versus Oregon when they came up to Salt Lake City that first time around. And he's just the kind of guy who has the strength. He's got really good hands as well. He can knock down offensive linemen's hands when they try to shoot and block him. He's got that gap shooting ability. He really is an explosive defensive tackle, and I think he's going to be the biggest key to Utah's defensive line this year in total. And while I think Van is very important, I just think if Junior can be one of those elite defensive tackles inside, it's going to allow this team to do things they maybe even haven't been able to do in previous years because they haven't had that.
Yeah, and I think this is a unique unit, and it's part of the reason why Utah is making that schematic change. It's a small thing in general, and we talk about, there is no Leki Fotu on this team, and I think the beauty of Leki Fotu and why people, gravitated to him so much is Kyle Whittingham talked about his ability to two-gap, and what it is you can occupy two gaps on the offensive line, specifically the A gaps, right? And you and I, both having played center, know how hard it is when there's one guy who can occupy both gaps. It really forces the offensive line into a problem. Utah doesn't have to two-gap this year. They can push the defensive line up the field. They can put more pressure into the backfield. They have some athletes in the defensive backfield and especially in the linebacker position that can flow and as long as they make sure that all the defensive linemen are where they need to be, then Utah's going to be fine. You're not going to see the kind of 2-3 yard consistent stops like you did with Nephi Sewell and Devin Lloyd. What you'll see some 3-yard losses and then a 4-yard gain, right? You'll see a 2-yard loss and maybe a 5-yard gain, then maybe a 3-yard gain, and then maybe a 2-yard loss in terms of defending the run. As far as sacks go, that's going to free these guys up to do a lot of unique things. And I think one thing that's worth noting about this Utah team specifically is if you look back at last year's season, and I pulled some of my pressure statistics off of Football Outsiders, one of my favorite places to go in terms of interpreting line stats because they do a really good job. Utah last year was 29th in the country with their sack rate at 8%. But on standard down sack rates, so just regular downs, across the board, they were ranked 11th at 8.1. Ooh. So that's going to be an area where you could see Utah possibly improving on that, where it's just when it's anyone's guess, Utah could go get a sack, right? Now, I think some of that's attributable to Morgan Scally, but the interesting part about it, on actual passing downs, the sack rate for Utah is 8.6%, which, in theory sounds like it's pretty good. That was 60th in the country. So not all that great by comparison to the other metrics. And so you have to wonder if this group and the talent that they have maybe increases the amount of sacks that Utah generates on specific passing downs. If so, I think that catapults Utah right up into that top 10 in the country in terms of sacks generated, and that should be very indicative of Utah having a successful season.
Yeah, always great when you get after the quarterback and get that pressure that we're talking about. And the guy who we expect to lead Utah in sacks and pressure is Van Fillinger this season, lengthy edge guy. The first time I saw him, he stood out to me right away. I was like, that's the kind of guy who has the tools and the potential to be a very high draft pick in the NFL if he's able to click and hit all those marks. And I think this year could be a big year if he decides to take that next step into getting into that high draft range as a player. But in terms of what he's just going to bring to Utah this year, I think he's just going to be a menace off the edge. I think he's a guy who is going to, early on in the season, he will have one of those 2 or 3 sack performances that leads to him getting doubled a lot on the season just because of that ability to get to the outside. And I think those long arms are going to be really useful in him batting passes down, Bryan.
100%. And it's one of those metrics that Utah really focuses on when they recruit their edge players. I think it's one of the reasons why they like Mickey Sungataranga so much. And while Mickey doesn't necessarily have that twitch that we see with Jonah Ellis, and Chase Kennedy's been a guy, newcomer that's gotten a lot of praise from the staff. I'm trying to think who else is there. Connor O'Toole, right? The names that we've heard. So you have basically 3 or 4 guys. I would not be surprised to see Mo Diabate out there because he's an incredible, very twitchy athlete.
Yes.
They have a lot of that. And when we talk about twitch, that's that explosion, that ability to get off the ball. But what Mickey has is he has extremely long arms, like you talk about, and he can get his hands on defenders initially very quickly. He's also a very stout guy at the defensive end position. And so I think you're going to see a lot of that kind of variety. He may not have the kind of moves that like a Jonah Ellis has per se. But in how Utah runs their scheme, that can be just as important, because I think one thing that when you talk about getting pressure, right, we all talk about sacks, and you talk about Van having those long arms and having a move and then a counter. And, I think his biggest thing is just, he has that speed and that strength, so he can just kind of get around the outside and just basically, bull rush or do a slap or whatever move it is that he needs to make. But having that counter on the opposite side in terms of your edge that can, in essence, set the edge and create that, that wall to keep the quarterback in there in the pocket, that's huge. And so I think that's going to be a credit to guys like, and we talk about Aliki Vamahi too. Like he was no slouch last year either. I think Aliki's a guy that we don't talk about very often, but he had 2 sacks in 10 games. And he's a guy who can generate some pressure. And the other thing, too, that I really want to start to focus on a little bit more with this defense is tackles for loss, because TFLs are very important, especially when you get into the Oregon State of the schedule and some of these other teams, and UCLA, some of these other teams that use their run game a little more proficiently. Arizona's a school that I think you're really going to need to get some TFLs for, because that means that you're not getting any yardage on those downs where you're running. And that's an area where Junior Tafuna was extremely good, had 5.5 TFLs last year. Van Fillinger, again, 9.5 TFLs. And I talked to Van about, his improvement in his run defense. And he said that was an area that he worked on a lot, because I think he had to make some ground. And so this defensive line as a whole, we love to talk sacks, right? That's the snazzy statistic and everything like that, but they do everything extremely well.
100%. And it is great when you have complete defensive linemen, guys you don't need to take, who are only 2 down defensive linemen, can be 3 down guys who can get after the passer and stop the run. And you alluded to a lot of that depth that Utah has. We're going to touch on that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you guys about BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news for every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, and, of course, college football, which is right around the corner. Guys, cash in on the Utes. If you guys think they're going to win the Pac-12, their odds going against Florida in Week 1, there are tons of great bets out there, as well as college awards you guys can look into on BetOnline. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. Also, I want to tell you guys about the Ultimate College Football Preview. Thank you again for making Locked On Utes your first listen every day. The Ultimate College Football Preview is here, a 7-episode preview with college experts, local team experts, and Odyssey college football insiders. It's everything you need to be ready for the college football season in one spot. Search for the Ultimate College Football Preview on your Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Guys, there's always so much turnover with college rosters each year, so make sure you guys check out the Ultimate College Football Preview. I recorded a Pac-12 preview with a lot of the other Locked On Pac-12 hosts, had a lot of fun with that one, so make sure you guys check out the Ultimate College Football Preview. So, diving into it for Utah, we know who the 2 best players on this defensive line are going to be. It's Van Fillinger and Junior Tafuna. But first, want to look to the outside, the edges. And I think a big guy that's intriguing to everyone in Bryan is Gabe Reid, guy coming over from Stanford, played at American Fork High School, so a little bit of homecoming for him, teaming with his brother as well in Corine. And Gabe's a guy who had a lot of sack production at Stanford as well. And he was even playing off ball more a little bit, linebacker spots. So I just think more from there. I think it's a really good opportunity for him coming in here with this Utah team to get things done up front.
Yeah, and like you said, I think he's a pressure specialist, and I think that's a really healthy addition for matchups. That's such an important part. I joked on the Utah Blockcast the other day that I'm going to teach all you young bloods something, that the game is about matchups. And it was interesting talking to Morgan Scally after practice the other day, and he and I had a conversation about that specifically, how important it is to get the right personnel and the right matchups to your advantage. And I think Utah's roster is built for that this year. And obviously Morgan gave me that look like, hey, quit trying to reveal the secret to the sauce. But they know that as well, and that's why they went after Gabe, and that's why he is, somebody that I think they're very confident in, and somebody that, the fans have heard a lot about in addition to, and that I think is always something that's very important. That we recognize those players that fans have heard a lot about, and explain to them how they're going to fit into the program, right? Because I think a lot of times, like you look at the top 10. I mean, this is the funny part about it, right? Like we've heard so much about Gabe Reid and the homecoming and playing with his brother and everything like that. And then you look at last year's sack leaders. It's Mika Tafua, Devin Lloyd, Cameron Good, Kayvon Thibodeau, both gone. Tuipulotu at USC, and then number 6 is Van Fillinger. Junior Tafuna at 13. And we don't really see a whole lot of variation in terms of other guys and other teams up there. Mm-hmm. Utah's got 4 or 5, right there in the top 10, top 12. And that to me is fascinating, because I think it speaks to just how good Utah was at what they're doing. And now you're adding a player with Gabe Reid who can fit into that. I think it's just a very, very positive addition for the Utes.
For sure. And he's not going to be alone as well, because he's had a lot. He's been nicked up a little bit, dealt with some injuries. So there are a lot of other guys along the edge spots for the Utes that can get it done, whether it is a Connor O'Toole, a Jonah Ellis. I think O'Toole is a guy we've heard a lot about from the coaching staff. So I'm excited to see what he's going to be able to do this year, Bryan. I think he'll be the guy, O'Toole, that's really going to come in, and he'll be the one at the end of the year that we're talking about, like we were with Van Fillinger last year. But who are some of these other guys at the defensive end spots you think are going to step up and play a big role this season for Utah?
Yeah, O'Toole's got the body for it. He's a former wide receiver converted to the defensive end position, and he has a very intimidating look to him now. He's the sideburns have grown into like a little bit of a chop situation, so he kind of got the Wolverine look to him, and he's gained, I think, 40 pounds in the course of the offseason, and it's, as Kyle Whittingham said, it's good weight too. He's the guy that I think has grabbed an opportunity and done the most that he could with it, and worked out with personal and private coaches all along the way, in addition to what he's been doing at Utah. But he's not alone. It's Jonah Ellis, is another guy who's worked extremely hard to gain that weight. And you look at him, he's still a little light up top, but his trunk and his lower half has gotten extremely strong. And I think that's a weird thing for most people to hear me talk about, and I understand that. But it's one of those things we talk about, sand in the pants in this game.
Yeah. You got to have those compact quads. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Listen. We're talking football, gang. We're okay with this, but he's not alone. There's also Chase Kennedy, the newcomer freshman from Texas that Utah and the staff is very high on, right? And he's made a positive impact in that room. And we talked about Connor O'Toole, and then Mickey, who I've gone, ad nauseum, and who I thought would be the eventual starter, and he is shown to play and be fairly proficient. The other thing too that's unique about this Utah football team is, there are going to be situations and alignments where we may see Devin Kafusi in a 5 technique, but he'll look like he's the defensive end, and that'll create some havoc as well. So there's a lot of options with this squad and this unit in particular. And there's just a lot of talent. We haven't talked about much at all about Tyler Weegis, who is a guy that I think Utah fans have been very high on. He hasn't been able to gain the weight like we thought, but just that goes to show how much talent there is on this roster at that position, that a guy that's been so highly thought of for so long can't even see the field because there's so much talent in front of him.
Yeah, it's the same thing with a guy like Mickey as well. We've heard the coaches raving about him all camp long. So this Utah team is in a really good place to continue to have that defensive end depth. One position that is interesting for them, and we just talked about how much we love Junior Tafuna, but the other defensive tackle spot, it does feel like it's a little bit, I personally don't feel as good about it as the defensive ends. I still think there's a lot of guys there who can get it done, but I think you've already heard Coach Witt talk about how he wants guys to put on a little bit extra weight. You lose a guy in Juani Pututau, who was a huge part of Utah's run defense a year ago as well. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how this interior of the defensive line outside of Junior Tafuna comes together, and if they're able to stop the run at an elite level like a year ago, and if some of those other guys, like maybe it is a Devin Kafusi, are able to step up and kind of build on that pressure rate.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting how Utah uses their interior guys together, right? So are you going to put Junior Tafuna and Aliki Vamahi together, or are you going to put, Vamahi and Devin Kafusi together, right? And use Tennessee Pututau with Junior because they kind of offset each other's skill sets. It's not as physically imposing a group in the past as it has been in the past, Samote Pepa's the one guy that I think on the roster, he's listed at 6'3", 345, and that sounds like, I know Utah likes their defensive tackles to be around the 340 mark, but I think Samote is a guy that at 345, 350, he still plays extremely well and is extremely explosive. Now the big deal with that group is they've been talking prehab and staying healthy and everything like that. It was something I talked to Mickey about at practice. How are you feeling? He's like, I'm healthy for once. And he joked that it was because of ibuprofen, right? But a lot of it has just been the focus on these guys really getting the work in before and after practice to make sure that they stay healthy. This is a unique group because we talk about Junior, but Aliki Vamahi is the one that if you talk to the offensive line, I think they have the hardest time blocking him. He's got a push-pull that is incredibly hard to figure out. And for first-time, opponents who have never seen him before, that's going to be something that they're going to have to really figure out. Now, he could play a lot at the one technique, and same with Tennessee Pututau, as they're both a little bit heavier, a little more stout. It'll be interesting to see how Tavita Fotu, the younger brother of Lecky, works into this equation as well. But this is a unit that's got some depth to it. They have the ability, and Coach Luther Ellis talked about it the other day on the conference call. He wants to rotate guys, and he wants to keep guys fresh, and that's a big step forward from last year where I think Utah struggled because they were kind of locked in on whoever was playing just being the guy.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a lot of guys, whether we are talking about the defensive tackles or defensive ends, just in general along the defensive line, there's a lot of guys who can come in and get things done. And it's going to be interesting to see how this group does in 2022. And Bryan, before we get you out of here, this is a Utah team now that's deep into fall camp. We're just over 2 weeks away from the Florida game. How are you feeling about this team right now?
Bored, ready for something that's going to give us a little bit better of an idea of how they truly match up. But I think, this is a team that I've been very confident and very bullish on. And, there's always some reticence when you sit in the positions that we do where you have a platform and a lot of people have access to you to make, in essence, guarantees of what you think a team's going to do or predictions. I think a lot of times people take your predictions as gospel, especially, when it's a knowledgeable group of people. And, I've watched Hans Olsen and other media members in the market have to struggle with that for years. And thankfully, I'm not that popular to where, the pitchforks and the the torches come out when things don't go according to plan. But, I think this is a team the makeup of this team is very different from what it was last year. This team is so businesslike, and we talked about the heat and things like that a little bit before the show. The other day after practice when we were up there, they were coming out, and it was supposedly 97 degrees with 90% humidity in the facility, in the practice facility. And these guys were still just, they were dripping sweat, right? Like it was clear that they had really had to work hard and it was hot in there, but they were still energized and moving around and focused. And I think that really is a credit to this group and the leadership and the tone that they've set at that program.
Yeah, and you can tell this team is excited. They're ready to go, from the players to the coaches, coaching staff. They are ready for week one down in Gainesville, and we are quickly approaching it as well. And if you guys are in the market for a second listen every day, trying to learn about more of the Pac-12 opponents around the conference, make sure you guys check out Locked On Pac-12, where host Spencer McLaughlin and other local Pac-12 experts will take you around the conference in under 30 minutes. I was recently on there talking about Oregon. I think Oregon's the kind of team that could be very interesting, depending on how the Utes are doing when they have to go to Eugene late in the season. So make sure you guys check out Locked On Pac-12. Make it your second listen every day. Bryan, huge thanks as always for stopping by this show. We thank you guys for listening to Locked On Utes another week, and a huge thanks once again for helping us get over 300 subscribers. We look forward to continue bringing you guys the Utah coverage you deserve. Have a great weekend.